She flipped an old wagon bed over her dugout. Elias Brome, who had survived 11 winters and buried his wife and son to the cold, told her plainly, "Those children will be dead by February." She had $31, 2 daughters, and needed a roof she could not build. On January 12, 1888, the temperature dropped 60 degrees in 6 hours. But 4 months earlier, Maren Tveit Haugen had never built a shelter in her life. She had arrived in Custer County in August of 1887 with 2 daughters, 1 mule, and a husband who still walked beside her. By September, she had 2 daughters, 1 mule, and a fresh grave on a rise where the wind never stopped. Ola Haugen died on a Tuesday. The lumber he had been hauling, second-hand planks bought cheap from a rail siding near Broken Bow, shifted when the wagon wheel dropped into a rut. The load caught him across the chest. Maren found him pinned, still breathing, his lips moving in Norwegian words she could not hear over the wind. By the time she freed him, he had stopped. She buried him with borrowed shovels and no minister. The girls stood in their one good dress each, Ragna holding Eli's hand so tight the younger one whimpered. The ground was still soft enough to dig. That would not last. The claim lay in a shallow draw north of Broken Bow, where a low rise gave partial shelter from the north wind but offered nothing else. No trees, no creek within easy reach. No neighbors close enough to see smoke from a chimney that did not yet exist. What they had was buffalo grass, hard-packed sod, a cut bank where the land folded into itself, and the contents of one wagon that would never move again. Maren inventoried what remained on the morning after the funeral. She did it out loud so the numbers would feel real. $31 in coin and paper. That was what survived after the lumber dealer took what Ola owed, after the man who sold them the mule collected the balance on the harness, after she paid the woman in town who had given them flour on credit during the journey west. One mule, aged and thin, with a split in its left rear hoof that would need watching. One milk cow that had gone dry 3 weeks early and now stood in the grass producing nothing but the need to be fed. One wagon with a cracked axle that Ola had planned to repair and never did. $17 worth of dimensional lumber, raw and uncut, that had cost her husband his life. Ragna, 8 years old, who could carry water and mind her sister but could not swing an axe or lift a beam. Eli, 5 years old, who coughed when the wind blew dust and woke crying in the night for a father who would not come. Maren counted it twice. The numbers did not improve. She had no frame for a house. She had no way to haul more lumber. She had no money to hire the work done. She had no male relative within 300 miles who might come to help. She had a piece of paper that said this land could be hers if she improved it and stayed, and she had a deadline that existed whether she acknowledged it or not. Winter was coming. Winter on the plains did not wait for widows to finish grieving. Elias Brome arrived on the 4th day after the burial. He was 58 years old, German-born, with a face like leather left too long in the sun. He had freighted goods to North Platte and Broken Bow when the railroad was still a rumor. He had survived 11 winters west of the 100th meridian, which was more than most men could claim. He had buried a wife and a son after the winter of 1880 to 81, when the cold came early and stayed late and took anyone who was not ready. He rode a dun mare and carried a stockman's whip coiled at his saddle. He did not dismount when he reached the Hogan claim. He sat his horse and looked at what remained. Maren came out to meet him. Ragna stood in the doorway of the canvas shelter they had rigged against the wagon's remaining side. Eli stayed inside, coughing. "Mrs. Haugen," Brome said. It was not a question. "Mr. Brome." She had heard his name in town. Everyone had. He did not offer condolences. Men like Brome did not waste words on things that could not be changed. Instead, he pointed with the handle of his whip. "That's your lumber?" "What's left of it?" "That's maybe enough for a door frame and part of a wall. You need 20 times that for a proper shack." "I know." He pointed again. "That's your sod?" "The whole draw is sod." "Sod needs cutting. Sod needs stacking. Sod needs a roof to sit under, and you've got no poles, no beams, no hired back to do the lifting." He shifted in his saddle. You know how to cut sod? I can learn. Learning takes time. Time is what you don't have. He looked at the sky, measuring something she could not see. 6 weeks, maybe 7 before first hard freeze. You'd need a crew of 3 working full days to get a soddy up proper. You'd need wood for the roof frame even then. You'd need, I know what I'd need. Do you? Brome's voice did not rise, but it sharpened. Because what I see is a woman with no house, no man, no money worth mentioning, and 2 children who will be dead by February if you don't face what's in front of you. Maren felt Ragna's eyes on her back. She did not turn. What do you suggest, Mr. Brome? Sell what you can, the mule, the cow, whatever lumber isn't ruined. Take your girls back east before the snow flies. Find family, find work. Find a man who can provide what you can't. This land is mine. Land won't keep your daughters warm. Brome gathered his reins. I've seen your kind before, proud, stubborn, Norwegian, which means twice as stubborn. I buried my own son because I was too proud to leave when leaving was the smart choice. Don't make me bury your girls because you couldn't see what was plain. He turned the mare. Maren's voice stopped him. Mr. Brome. He looked back. What would you build if you had what I have, if you had 6 weeks? For the first time, something moved behind his eyes. Not sympathy, recognition. I wouldn't build anything, Mrs. Haugen. I'd dig. Dig into that bank there and make a hole just big enough to survive in. Forget pretty. Forget proper. Forget everything except getting your children underground before the cold comes. He studied her. But even that needs a roof. Even a dugout needs something over the top, and you haven't got it. He rode away. He did not look back again. Maren stood in the draw after he left, counting what she had against what she needed. A dugout. The word sat in her mind like a stone in her shoe. She knew what dugouts were. She had seen them from the train window coming west, dark mouths in hillsides, smoke rising from pipes stuck in the earth, places where people lived like animals because they had no choice. She had promised Ola they would never live in a hole. Ola was dead. The math was simple. A frame house needed lumber she could not afford, and labor she could not provide. A proper sod house needed roof timbers she did not have, and time that was bleeding away with every sunset. A dugout needed only a bank to dig into, and something, anything, to keep the weather out. But even Brome had said it. A dugout needs a roof. She walked the claim that evening while the girls slept. She walked the fence lines that Ola had started and never finished. She walked past the grave on the rise, not stopping, not looking. She walked until she reached the edge of their land where their neighbor's property began, and that was where she saw it. The wagon bed lay half sunk in the grass like a ship run aground. The running gear was gone, salvaged or stolen. She did not know. What remained was the bed itself. A wooden box roughly 10 feet long and 4 feet wide, built of oak planks that had weathered but not rotted, with a curved top edge that swept up at the front like the prow of a boat. She had seen it before. Everyone had. It was junk, salvage, something a previous homesteader had abandoned when they gave up and left. It had sat there for 2 years or more, settling into the earth, becoming part of the landscape. Maren stood over it as the sun went down. She pressed her palm against the wood. Solid, tight-jointed. The oak had dried and hardened in the prairie air. A wagon bed was built to carry weight. A wagon bed was built to keep rain off whatever sat inside it. If you flipped it over, she crouched beside it, tracing the shape with her fingers. If you flipped it over and set it on top of a hole in the ground, the curved top would shed water, would shed snow, would shed wind. It was not a roof, it was not a proper anything, but it was 10 feet of solid oak, and it was sitting there for the taking. She told no one. The next morning she walked to the neighbor's claim, the Tanners, who had left for Kansas in the spring, and confirmed what she already knew. The land had been abandoned. The wagon bed belonged to no one who would come looking for it. Then she went to the cut bank and began to dig. The sod came up in chunks at first, roots tangled like fingers refusing to let go. Maren used the only shovel she had, a tool with a handle worn smooth by Ola's hands. She marked out a rectangle roughly 8 feet by 10 feet, smaller than any house, smaller than most sod dwellings she had seen, barely enough room for 3 people to lie down. That was the point. She had done the calculation in her head the night before, remembering the stone huts of her childhood in Norway, the way old farmers talked about keeping warmth close. A large room needs a large fire. A small room needs only a small one. The smaller the space, the less heat escapes. She was not building a home, she was building a box just big enough to trap warmth and stay alive. The digging went slowly. By noon on the first day, she had cleared less than a foot of depth across the marked area. Her shoulders burned. Her hands blistered and bled. Eli watched from the canvas shelter, coughing, while Ragna brought water from the spring and said nothing. By the third day, Maren had excavated perhaps 2 feet into the bank. The rear wall was taking shape, earth packed hard, cutting into the slope so the ground itself would form one side of the shelter. She dug a shallow shelf along one wall for sleeping. She dug a narrow trench near what would be the entrance, angled to drain water if it seeped in. And every evening she walked to the abandoned wagon bed and studied it, measured it with her hands, pictured it settling over the holes she was making. It would not be a house. It might not even be a shelter in any proper sense. But it would be something. Lute Jessen found her on the 5th day. He was 34, a homesteader from 2 claims over, a practical man with practical concerns. He had a wife and 3 children, and a half-finished lean-to that he was trying to turn into a cabin before winter. He had no time to spare and no charity to give, but he had seen the smoke from her morning fire, and curiosity had brought him close enough to see what she was doing. Mrs. Haugen. He stood at the edge of her digging, looking down at the raw earth. That a root cellar you're working on? Something like that. He studied the dimensions. His face did not change, but something behind his eyes did. That's too small for storage, too shallow for a proper cellar. He walked the perimeter. That's a living space. You're digging a dugout. I'm digging a hole. Call it what you want. You're going to winter in there? If I can roof it... Jessen laughed. It was not a cruel laugh, but it was not kind either. It was the laugh of a man who had seen too many people fail to find failure surprising. Roof it with what? You've got no timber. I passed your lumber stack. That's door frames and flooring, not roof beams. And sod on a brush roof won't hold, not when the snow load's on. First real storm, you'll have a cave-in. I know. Then what's your plan? Maren pointed toward the abandoned claim. There's a wagon bed sitting in the grass over there. Oak planks, tight joints, curved top. Jessen stared at her. He looked toward where she pointed, then back at her. You're going to put a wagon bed on top of a hole in the ground. If I can move it. You can't. I have a mule. You have a mule that's older than my father and a harness that's half rotted. And even if you drag that thing over here, what then? A wagon bed isn't a roof. It's not sealed. It's not insulated. You'll have wind coming through every gap. You'll have rain running down the sides. I'll have oak over my head instead of canvas. Jessen shook his head. He was not arguing now. He was cataloging problems, the way practical men do when they see disaster coming. A wagon carries grain, he said. It doesn't keep winter out. A wagon bed keeps rain off the grain. Rain isn't a January blizzard. No, Maren agreed. It isn't. She went back to digging. After a while, Jessen left, but she heard him muttering as he walked away, and the words carried on the still air. Norwegian woman, he said to himself, or to no one, burying herself and her children in a hole and covering it with junk. The wagon bed weighed more than Maren could lift alone. She had known this. She had planned for it. What she had not planned for was the harness breaking on the first attempt. The leather gave way at the stitching, where Ola had meant to reinforce it and never did. The mule lurched forward, the wagon bed shifted 3 inches, and then the harness snapped and the whole arrangement came apart. Maren sat in the grass beside the ruined leather and did not cry. Crying was a luxury. Crying took time. She did not have time. She had rope. She had strips of canvas that could be twisted into cordage. She had a mule that would work if she could rig something to make it pull. She worked through the night, braiding and knotting by firelight while Ragna slept, and Eli coughed and the stars wheeled overhead. By dawn, she had something that might hold. By mid-morning, she was back at the wagon bed with her makeshift harness, her exhausted mule, and a block and tackle she had found in Ola's tools. The bed moved, inch by inch, groaning against the earth. It moved. It took her 2 days to drag it to the dugout site. The mule went lame on the second day, favoring the split hoof, and she had to rest it for 6 hours before continuing. When the bed finally sat beside the holes she had dug, she stood over it and felt nothing but the weight of what came next. She had to flip it. She had to lift one edge, tip the whole thing over, and settle it down onto the cut earth so the curved top faced the sky. She could not do it alone, but she was alone. Silas Vorn came to the claim on the day Marin realized she could not flip the wagon bed. He rode a black horse and wore a town coat despite the prairie dust. His store in Broken Bow sold dry goods, hardware, and hope to settlers who had neither. He also bought claims, distressed claims, abandoned claims, claims whose owners had died or fled and left behind debts that Vorn was happy to collect. He had extended credit to the Haugens, small amounts carefully noted in his ledger, flour, nails, lamp oil, enough to create a debt, not enough to seem predatory. Now he had come to survey his investment. Mrs. Haugen. He did not dismount. He sat his horse and looked at the hole in the ground, at the wagon bed lying beside it, at the widow standing in the dirt with raw hands and a set jaw. "I heard you've been digging." Word travels. Word always travels. He smiled. It was the smile of a man who understood exactly how information moved in small places. "They're saying you've lost your mind, building a badger hole, planning to live underground like some kind of animal. They can say what they like. They're saying you'll be dead by Christmas, you and those girls." The smile did not fade. "I hope that's not true. I truly do. But if it is, if things become difficult, I want you to know that I'm here to help." Help. The debt your husband left. It's not large, but it's there, and it comes due whether you're ready or not. Now I could call it in, force a sale, take the mule, the cow, whatever else has value. He spread his hands. "But I'm not that kind of man. I'd rather see you succeed. So if you find yourself struggling, if you need credit for supplies, or if you decide the claim is more trouble than it's worth, come see me. We can work something out." Marin looked at him. She understood exactly what he was offering. "Mr. Vorn, how many claims have you acquired from widows?" His smile flickered, just for a moment. "I don't keep count, Mrs. Haugen. I help people who need helping. That's all. And if I don't need your help, then I wish you well." He gathered his reins. "But winter is long, Mrs. Haugen, and these plains have buried stronger people than you." He rode away without looking back. Marin watched him go. Then she walked to the wagon bed and pressed both palms against the oak. She could not flip it alone. She had no one to help. She had no money to hire the work done. But she had a mule, a block and tackle, and rope. There had to be a way. She spent that night awake, sketching in the dirt by firelight. The problem was leverage. The wagon bed weighed perhaps 300 pounds, more than she could lift, but not more than physics could move. She needed a fulcrum. She needed to raise one edge high enough that the whole thing would tip past its balance point and fall into position. She thought about poles. She had no poles long enough. She thought about ramps. She could build a ramp of earth, drag the bed up part way, and then no. The mule could not pull uphill, not with that hoof, not with that weight. She thought about the cut bank itself, the bank she had dug into. If she positioned the bed at the edge of the cut, if she raised one side just enough, the slope of the land would help it tip. By dawn, she had a plan. By noon, she was moving. She repositioned the wagon bed so its long edge paralleled the cut. She dug a shallow trough beneath the far edge, giving it somewhere to settle when it fell. She rigged the block and tackle to a stake driven deep into the ground on the high side. Then she began to lift. The mule pulled. The rope creaked. The wagon bed groaned and shifted, rising inch by inch on the near side. Maren braced herself against the far edge, pushing upward with everything she had, while the mule provided the main force. 3 inches. 6 inches. A foot. The bed reached the tipping point. For one terrible moment it hung there, balanced on its edge, ready to fall either direction. Maren threw her weight against it. The wagon bed crashed down over the cut, landing upside down with a sound like thunder, settling into the earth with its curved crown facing the sky. She stood there panting, trembling, staring at what she had done. It looked absurd. A wagon bed swallowed by the ground, a wooden hump rising from the prairie like the back of some buried beast. But it was over her hole. It was covering the space she had dug. And when she crawled underneath to check, she found what she had hoped for. Solid oak above her head, earth walls on 3 sides, a shelter, not finished, not sealed, not safe, but a beginning. The ceiling began the next morning. Maren had studied the gaps before she slept, the places where light came through, the joints where wind would enter, the edges where the wagon bed sat imperfectly on the earthen walls. She had counted them. She had measured them with her fingers. Now she had to close them. Clay first. She hauled it from the creek bed where the ground stayed damp, bucket by bucket, load by load. The girls helped Rana carrying what she could, Eli dragging smaller containers when her coughing allowed. They packed the clay into the gaps between wood and earth, smoothing it with their hands until the worst of the light disappeared. Then grass. Long prairie grass, dried and twisted into ropes, stuffed into the seams where clay alone would not hold. The grass would rot eventually, but eventually was a problem for later. Now was the problem for now. Then sod. Maren cut squares of it from the surrounding ground, each one roughly 2 feet on a side and 4 inches thick, heavy with roots and soil. She stacked them along the edges of the wagon bed, banking the shelter against wind. She layered them over the curved crown, adding weight and insulation. Each square added heat retention. Each square added snow shedding capacity. Each square added risk. Lute Jessen came by on the 3rd day of sealing. He stood at the edge of the site and watched her stack sod onto the wagon bed's crown. "You're putting too much weight on it," he said. Maren did not stop working. "I know. That oak is strong, but it's not a roof beam. It's not designed to carry load like that. First heavy snow, it'll crush inward." "Maybe." "Not maybe, certainly." He stepped closer. "Mrs. Haugen, I'm not trying to mock you. I'm trying to help. The idea, the wagon bed, the low shelter, keeping the space small, I can see the logic. But you're going to kill yourself and your girls if you load that thing wrong. The weight has to be distributed. Heavier at the edges where the earth supports it, lighter across the span." Maren stopped. She looked at him. "Show me." Jessen blinked. Whatever he had expected, it was not that. I don't have time to help you build this thing. I'm not asking you to build it. I'm asking you to show me where the weight should go. One time. Then you can leave." He looked at the shelter. He looked at Maren. He looked at the sky, where clouds were building in the west. "Fine," he said. "But I want it known that I think this is a foolishness." "Noted." He spent an hour with her. He showed her how to read the span of the wagon bed, where it was strongest, where it was weakest. He showed her how to bank the sod along the supported edges first, building up the weight gradually, leaving the center crown lighter. He showed her how to angle the outer layers so snow would shed off the sides instead of pooling on top. When he left, Maren kept working. She worked until dark, then lit a fire and worked by firelight, then slept for 4 hours and rose before dawn to work again. The shelter was not finished. The shelter might never be finished in any proper sense, but the walls were sealed. The crown was banked. The door was framed with salvaged boards from Ola's lumber, hung on leather hinges cut from the ruined harness. When Maren crawled inside for the first time and pulled the door closed behind her, the wind stopped. She could hear it outside, pressing against the sod, testing the seams. but inside there was stillness. Inside there was dark and close air, and the smell of earth and clay and grass. Inside there was something that might keep her children alive. The stove was the next problem. Maren had a small barrel stove that Ola had bought secondhand in Broken Bow. It was crude but functional, a converted fuel barrel with a door cut in the front and a pipe collar welded to the top. It could burn wood or coal or twisted prairie grass, and it threw heat well enough for a canvas shelter. But putting a stove inside a wooden structure meant fire. Putting a stove inside a wooden structure with sod piled on top meant choosing between freezing and burning. She needed a way to vent the smoke without setting the wagon bed alight. She needed a chimney opening that would not become an ignition point when the pipe got hot. This was beyond her knowledge. She knew it. She admitted it to herself the way she admitted all the things she did not know clearly, without flinching, because flinching did not solve problems. She needed help. Nels Grenheim lived 2 miles west in a sod dwelling he had built himself 11 years before. He was 63 years old, Norwegian like Maren, a bachelor who had never married and never explained why. He had worked as a road builder and winter freighter in his younger days. He had survived on the plains longer than almost anyone. He had also not spoken to anyone from town in nearly 3 years. Maren knew this. Everyone knew this. Nels Grindheim was not cruel, people said, but he was strange. He lived alone. He wanted to live alone. He did not welcome visitors. She went anyway. The walk took an hour. She left the girls with instructions to stay inside the canvas shelter, to keep the fire small, to not open the door for anyone except her. Ragna nodded solemnly. Eli coughed and said nothing. Grindheim's soddy sat in a low spot where the wind split around a natural rise. Smoke rose from a chimney that had been built and rebuilt over the years. The door was heavy timber, weathered nearly black. Maren knocked. Silence. She knocked again. "Go away." The voice came from inside, flat and uninterested. "Mr. Grindheim, my name is Maren Haugen, my husband. I know who you are. I know your husband died. I know you're digging a hole in the ground and putting junk over it. I know what everyone knows." A pause. "What I don't know is why you're on my doorstep. I need help." "Everyone needs help. That's not my concern." "I need to know how to put a stove in a wooden shelter without burning it down." Silence. Longer this time. Then the door opened. Grindheim was tall and thin, with a face carved by decades of wind and cold. His eyes were pale blue, almost colorless, and they studied Maren with the same expression he might use to study a horse for sale. "A wooden shelter," he said. "The wagon bed." "Yes?" "You're going to burn inside that thing." "Not if I vent it properly." "You don't know how to vent it properly. That's why you're here." "Yes." He looked at her for a long moment. Then he stepped outside and closed the door behind him. "Show me," he said. They walked back to the claim in silence. Grindheim moved with a strange efficiency, covering ground without seeming to hurry. He did not ask questions. He did not make conversation. He simply walked, and Maren walked beside him, and the prairie stretched around them in every direction. When they reached the shelter, Grindheim stopped and stared at it. The wagon bed sat over the cut like a hump of earth sprouting boards. Sod banked the edges. Clay sealed the gaps. The door hung crooked in its frame. Smoke would not rise from it because there was no chimney yet, no stove, no fire. "Ugly," Grindheim said. "Yes." "Low. That's intentional. Less air to heat." He looked at her. Something shifted in his expression, not approval exactly, but recognition. "You kept it low," he said. "I kept it as small as I could. 3 people, 1 stove. The smaller the space, the less heat escapes." "Who told you that?" "No one. I remembered it from Norway. The old houses. The way my grandmother talked about keeping warmth close." Grindheim grunted. He walked around the shelter, studying the angles, pressing his hand against the sod, crouching to examine the doorframe. Then he knelt at the highest point of the curved wagon bed crown and ran his fingers along the wood. You need to cut here, he said. Through the planks. Big enough for a pipe collar, but not so big you weaken the span. Then you need to widen the hole, make it bigger than the pipe itself. The pipe can't touch the wood directly, not ever. You need a gap, and the gap needs to be filled with clay. Wet clay, packed thick, and damp earth around that. The clay holds the heat. The pipe never touches wood. You understand? Maren knelt beside him. She studied the spot he was indicating. How thick? 3 inches minimum around the pipe. 4 is better, and you need to check it. Every time you let the fire get hot, you check the collar afterward. If the clay cracks, you patch it. If the wood chars, you've done something wrong and you fix it before you light another fire. Show me. Grindheim did not leave that day. He did not leave the next day either. He did not explain why he stayed. He did not offer comfort or conversation. He simply worked, measuring, cutting, demonstrating while Maren watched and learned. He showed her how to score the oak planks with a handsaw, how to chisel out the chimney opening, how to build up the clay collar in layers so it would not crack from heat. He showed her how to test the draft by holding a smoking strip of rag near the opening. If the smoke drew upward and out, the draft was good. If it swirled and pooled, something was blocked and needed clearing. He showed her how to notice the smell of hot wood before it became the smell of burning wood. The trick is not warmth, he told her on the second day, while they were packing clay around the stovepipe collar. The trick is knowing what winter can steal first. What does it steal first? Air, then heat, then hope. He smoothed the clay with calloused fingers. This shelter of yours, it's ugly, and it's small, and it's not what anyone else would build. But you're building for the weather you have, not the house you wish for. That's the difference between people who survive out here and people who don't. Maren said nothing, but she remembered the words. On the morning Grindheim left, the shelter was habitable. Not finished, nothing was ever truly finished, but habitable. The stove sat in the corner with its chimney rising through the clay-packed collar. The door closed against its frame. The sod banking held steady against the earthen walls. Maren lit the first fire while her daughters watched. Smoke rose through the pipe and out. The interior warmed slowly, then faster still. The small space trapped heat the way she had designed it to, the way she had hoped it would. Grindheim stood outside, watching the smoke rise from what looked like a wound in the earth. You're not done, he said. The draft will need adjusting when the weather changes. The sod will settle and create gaps you'll have to patch. The door needs a better seal. You'll want to build a baffle inside to break the wind when you open it. I know. And the weight on that crown, Jessen was right. You need to watch it. After every heavy snow, you clear the top. You don't let it load up. You understand? I understand. He nodded once. Then he walked away, heading back toward his soddy 2 miles west. Maren watched him go. The wind was picking up, carrying the smell of distant rain or maybe distant snow. She had a shelter. She had a stove. She had clay and sod and a wagon bed between her children and the sky. She had perhaps 5 weeks until deep winter arrived. She had no idea if it would be enough. The weeks that followed measured themselves in labor. Maren rose before dawn and worked until she could not see her hands. She cut sod until her shoulders seized. She hauled clay until her back screamed. She patched and sealed and reinforced until her fingers cracked and bled, and healed and cracked again. The girls helped where they could. Ragna learned to mix clay with water to the right consistency, thick enough to hold, thin enough to spread. Eli gathered dried grass for stuffing gaps, though her coughing fits came more often now, bending her double in the cold morning air. October passed. The grass turned brown. The first frost came and went, leaving ice on the water bucket and a warning in the air. Maren counted what remained. $23. She had spent $8 on lamp oil, nails, and a length of stovepipe to extend the chimney higher. The higher pipe would draw better, Grindheim had said. It would also catch more wind. Everything on the plains was a trade-off. The fuel problem grew worse as the days shortened. A proper winter required wood. 6 cords at minimum, Elias Brome had said, and he was not wrong. 6 cords meant 600 cubic feet of split, stacked, seasoned timber ready to burn. Maren had less than 2 cords. The lumber Ola had bought was construction grade, too valuable to burn, not enough to build with. The scraps she had collected from abandoned homesteads and fallen fences amounted to kindling, not fuel. She needed more. She could not afford more. The arithmetic was simple and brutal. At 50 cents a cord for the cheapest cottonwood, wet, unseasoned, barely worth burning, she would need $3 just to survive until January. At $1 a cord for decent fuel, she would need 6. At the prices Silas Vaughan charged in his store, delivered to the claim, she would be broke before Thanksgiving. She began collecting buffalo chips. The dried dung lay scattered across the prairie, left behind by herds that no longer existed. It burned poorly compared to wood, more smoke, less heat, a smell that clung to clothing and hair. But it was free, and free was the only currency Maren had left. She and Ragna filled sacks with the dried patties, hauling them back to the claim and stacking them in a covered pile beside the shelter. Eli watched from the doorway, too weak now to help, her cough echoing across the empty draw. "Mama," Ragna said one evening as they dumped another load onto the pile, "is this enough?" Maren looked at what they had gathered. Perhaps a month's worth of supplemental fuel if she burned it carefully, if she mixed it with the little wood she had, if the winter was mild. The winter would not be mild. She knew this the way she knew the sun would rise. "It's a start," she said. Nels Grindheim returned on a morning when the wind carried the first real bite of cold. He came without announcement, as he always did, appearing at the edge of the claim with a canvas sack over his shoulder and his pale eyes taking in everything. Maren was on the roof of the shelter, if it could be called a roof, clearing loose sod that had shifted in the night. "You're loading the center wrong," he said by way of greeting. Maren climbed down. Her hands were numb. She had forgotten her gloves inside. "I cleared it yesterday." And it shifted back. "The wind is loading snow on the high side, and you're compensating by piling sod on the low side. That's backwards. You need to break the wind before it gets to the roof, not armor the roof against it." "How?" Grindheim set down his sack. Inside were twisted bundles of dried grass and something that looked like rope made from woven strips of cloth. "A snow wall," he said. 3 feet high, 4 feet out from the windward edge. The wind hits the wall, rises, clears the roof. Most of the drift falls behind the wall instead of on top of your shelter. I don't have materials for a wall. You have sod. You have earth. You have hands. He looked at her. And you have me today. Tomorrow I have my own work. They built the snow wall together. Grindheim showed her how to cut the sod blocks at an angle so they locked together, how to stagger the courses like brickwork, how to bank earth against the backside for stability. The wall rose slowly, curving around the north and west edges of the shelter like a windbreak. While they worked, Grindheim talked. Not much. He was not a man who wasted words, but enough. He told her about the winter of 1880 to 81, when the snow started in October and did not stop until April. He told her about the families who had starved because they could not reach their stock. He told her about a child he had found frozen in a drift, 300 yards from her own front door. She had gone to check the chickens, he said. Storm came up fast. She got turned around, couldn't see the house, walked right past it. They found her in the spring. Maren said nothing. She kept cutting sod. "You're wondering why I'm telling you this. I'm wondering why you're helping me." Grindheim paused, a sod block in his hands. He looked at the shelter, at the smoke rising from the chimney where Ragna was tending a small fire inside. "Because you're not pretending," he said. "Most people out here, they build for the life they want. They build houses that would be fine in Ohio. They build like the weather is a problem to be ignored instead of an enemy to be survived. You're building for what's real. That's rare. I'm building because I have no choice. That's the only reason anyone builds anything worth keeping." He set the sod block in place and reached for another. The entry throat took shape over the following days. Grindheim had explained the concept before he left. a short, low passage between the outer door and the main chamber, angled to break the direct path of the wind. Cold air was heavier than warm air. If the passage turned, the cold would have to climb to enter. Most of it would settle in the throat instead. Maren built it with salvaged boards and more clay, creating a tunnel barely 3 feet long and low enough that she had to crawl through it. The girls hated it. Eli cried the first time she had to squeeze through. But when the wind blew and Maren opened the outer door to check the weather, the interior temperature barely dropped. The throat worked. She marked that as a victory. Victories were scarce enough to count. November arrived cold and stayed cold. The first real snow fell on the 8th, a dry powder that hissed against the sod walls and piled in corners. Maren cleared the roof twice that day, climbing up with a flatboard to push the accumulation off the crown. The wagon bed groaned beneath even that light load, and she remembered Lute Jessen's warning. The second snow came 3 days later, heavier, wetter, the kind that packed into ice if you let it sit. Maren cleared it before dawn, and again at midday. Her arms shook with exhaustion by the time the sky cleared. "You can't do this every time it snows," Ragna said, watching from the entry throat. "You'll wear yourself out." "I'll wear myself out, or the roof will collapse. Those are the choices." "What if you get sick? What if you can't climb up?" Maren had no answer for that. She climbed down and went inside to check on Eli, who was sleeping again, her breathing shallow and rough. Elias Brome returned on a day when the temperature dropped low enough to freeze the mucus in Maren's nose. He rode the same dun mare, wore the same stockman's coat, carried the same whip coiled at his saddle. He stopped at the edge of the claim and studied what he saw. The shelter had changed since his last visit. The snow wall curved around the windward side. The entry throat jutted out like a second smaller mound. Smoke rose from the chimney, and the sod banking had been reinforced with additional layers. It still looked like a wagon bed swallowed by the earth. But it looked more deliberate now, more considered. Brome dismounted. He walked the perimeter the way he had before, checking the angles, pressing his hand against the sod. When he reached the entry throat, he crouched and peered inside. Maren emerged from the interior, wiping her hands on her apron. "Mr. Brome." "Mrs. Haugen." He straightened slowly, his joints protesting the cold. "I expected to find you gone by now. I'm still here. I can see that." He looked at the shelter again. "This is different than what you had before." "I've made improvements." "The snow wall?" "Grienheim showed me." Something flickered across Brome's face at the mention of the name. Respect, perhaps, or surprise. "Nels Grienheim helped you." "He did." "Grienheim doesn't help anyone." "He helped me." Brome was silent for a moment. Then he walked to the snow wall and examined the construction, running his gloved hand along the staggered sod courses. "This is good work," he said. "The angle is right. The banking is solid." He turned back to her. "But a snow wall won't stop a blizzard. This shelter of yours, it might hold for a regular winter. Might. But if we get a true storm, the kind that killed half the cattle in Custer County in '81, then I'll die trying something instead of dying doing nothing." Brome studied her. The wind cut between them, sharp as a blade. "You've got children in there." "I know what I've got." "And you're gambling their lives on a wagon bed and some sod." "I'm gambling their lives on the only thing I could build. You told me to dig. I dug. You told me I needed a roof. I found one. What else would you have me do?" For a long moment, Brome did not answer. Then, slowly, he reached into his saddlebag and pulled out a bundle wrapped in oilcloth. "Dried beef," he said. "My wife made too much. It'll spoil if no one eats it." He held it out. Maren did not move. "I don't take charity." "It's not charity. It's trade." He set the bundle on the snow wall. "You've got that milk cow standing out here doing nothing. She'll freeze before she freshens again anyway. I'll take her off your hands for $8 and this beef." The cow was worth $12 at least, maybe 15, but $12 didn't exist. $8 did. 10, Maren said. Brome almost smiled. 9. Done. He counted out the coins and left the beef on the wall. When he rode away, Marn stood in the cold and held the money in her hand. $9. Enough for 3 cords of bad wood, or 1.5 cords of good wood. Enough to see Christmas if she was careful. Enough to live a little longer. The cow left with Brome's hired hand 2 days later. The shelter felt emptier without her, though she had never been inside it. The girls cried. Maren did not cry. She bought wood with the money and stacked it against the snow wall where the wind could not reach it. December came. The days blurred into a rhythm of survival. Morning. Wake before dawn. Check the fire. Check the chimney. Check Eli's breathing. Clear snow if there was snow to clear. Melt ice for water. Cook what little there was to cook. Midday. Repair what needed repairing. Patch the gaps that opened overnight. Bank more earth against the walls. Check the fuel supply. Count the remaining wood. Count the remaining food. Count the days until spring. Evening. Feed the girls. Tell them stories. Pretend that everything would be fine. Put them to bed on the raised shelf Maren had dug into the earthen wall. Tend the fire through the night. Sleep in shifts, waking every few hours to add fuel and check the draft. Eli's cough grew worse. Then it grew better. Then it grew worse again. Maren dosed her with willow bark tea when they had willow bark, with honey when they had honey, with nothing when they had nothing. The temperature dropped. Rose. Dropped again. Christmas passed with no celebration. Maren gave each girl an orange she had bought for 3 cents each in Broken Bow, a luxury that made Ragna cry. They ate the beef from Brome slowly, rationing each strip, making it last. January arrived. The shelter had settled into itself by then. The wagon bed no longer groaned when weight pressed on the crown. The sod had packed down, sealing gaps that had leaked air in November. The entry throat blocked wind well enough that Maren could open the outer door without feeling the interior temperature plunge. She began to notice things. A pan of water left near the sleeping shelf formed skim ice overnight, but not full freeze. That meant the interior was staying above 32 degrees, even when the exterior dropped to 0. Frost formed on the inside of the entry throat, but not on the interior walls. That meant the main chamber was holding heat better than the passage. The fuel consumption was lower than she had calculated. The small space heated faster and held warmth longer than a larger structure would have. She was burning perhaps 2/3 what a proper cabin would require. She told Lute Jessen this when he stopped by in early January to check on her. He listened without expression. "Mild weather proves nothing," he said. "We haven't had a real storm yet. We've had snow. We've had dustings. We haven't had weather." He looked at the shelter with something that might have been grudging respect, or might have been pity. "I hope you're right, Mrs. Hogan. I hope that thing holds, but the winter isn't over yet." He left. Maren watched him go, then went back inside where Eli was coughing again. The morning of January 12th dawned mild. Maren noticed it immediately when she opened the outer door of the entry throat. The air was almost warm, 35 degrees, perhaps 40. The sky was clear. The wind was soft. It felt like a gift. It felt like spring had arrived 2 months early. Eli's cough had eased during the night. She was sitting up on the sleeping shelf, asking for food, her cheeks less hollow than they had been a week ago. Ragna was humming a Norwegian hymn their father had taught them, something she had not done since he died. Maren let herself feel, for just a moment, that they might survive this. She sent Ragna to gather more buffalo chips from the far end of the claim, where a drift had exposed a patch they had missed in the fall. The girl went happily, glad for the excuse to be outside in the mild air. Maren stayed with Eli, mashing dried beef into a broth thin enough for the girl to swallow. They talked about Norway, about the farm where Maren had grown up, about the grandmother who had lived in a stone hut and kept her family alive through a winter that everyone said was impossible. "Was she scared?" Eli asked. "Probably." "Are you scared?" Maren looked at her daughter, 5 years old, thin as kindling, alive. "Every day," she said. "But being scared doesn't mean you stop." Ragna was halfway to the far end of the claim when the sky changed. Maren saw it from the entry throat, where she had gone to check on the girl's progress. The clear blue sky to the northwest was no longer clear. A wall of gray was rising from the horizon, moving faster than any cloud had a right to move. She had never seen anything like it. It looked like the edge of the world coming to swallow everything. "Ragna!" she screamed. "Come back! Now!" The girl turned. She saw the wall, too. She started running. The temperature dropped. Maren felt it like a physical blow, the air changing around her, the mild morning turning hostile in seconds. The wind shifted, swinging from south to north, and it carried something with it. Fine snow, dry snow, snow that moved sideways instead of falling, that hissed against the sod walls like sand. Ragna was still running. She was 100 yards away, 80, 60. The wall hit. One moment Maren could see her daughter. The next moment there was only white. White in every direction, white that roared, white that blinded and deafened and turned the world into a howling nothing. "Ragna!" She could not hear her own voice. She could not see the ground. She could not see her hand in front of her face. She ran. She did not know which direction. She could not tell. She ran toward where Ragna had been, fighting wind that wanted to knock her down, breathing air that was more snow than oxygen. Her foot hit something. A body. Small. Maren grabbed and pulled, hauling the weight toward where the shelter had to be, where she thought the shelter might be, where she prayed to every god she had ever been taught that the shelter would still exist. Her hand found sod. The snow wall. She had hit the snow wall. She followed it, dragging Ragna, gasping in air that froze in her lungs. The wall curved. The entry throat appeared. She shoved her daughter through the opening and dove in after her. Inside, Eli was screaming. The first hour was pure survival. Maren sealed the outer door of the entry throat with every blanket and rag she could find. The wind found gaps anyway, pushing fine snow through cracks she had thought were sealed. She packed more clay, more grass, more cloth, fighting the cold that wanted to enter. Ragna lay on the sleeping shelf, shaking uncontrollably. Her face was white. Her fingers were white. Maren stripped the wet clothes from her body and wrapped her in every dry thing they had, then lay beside her, pressing her own warmth into the girl's frozen skin. Eli coughed and coughed, the cold air aggravating whatever illness still lived in her lungs. The stove burned. Maren fed it more than she should, burning through fuel at a rate that terrified her, because the alternative was letting the temperature drop and losing Ragna to frostbite. Outside, the wind screamed. It was a sound Maren had never heard before, not just loud, violent. It struck the shelter in gusts that made the wagon bed creak, that made the sod walls shudder, that made her wonder with every gust if this was the one that would finally tear everything apart. The temperature inside the shelter dropped despite the fire. 40 degrees, 35, 30. She fed the stove again, and again. By the second hour, the draft began to fail. Maren noticed it when smoke started pooling near the ceiling instead of rising out. The chimney was blocked. Snow or ice or something. She could not tell what, but the smoke had nowhere to go. The interior filled with gray haze. Eli's coughing turned to choking. Ragna stirred on the shelf, disoriented, calling for her father. Maren had to clear the chimney. She had to go outside. She remembered Greenheim's lesson, the hooked pole. She had made one, a long stick with a curved nail at the end, kept near the entry throat for exactly this purpose. She found it by feel in the smoke-filled darkness. She pushed open the outer door of the entry throat and was slammed backward by wind that felt like a fist. The world outside was invisible, not dim, not obscured, completely, utterly invisible. The snow was so thick and the wind so strong that she could not see the door frame while her hand was touching it. She pushed the pole out into the white. She could not see the chimney. She could not see anything. She swept the pole in an arc, hoping to catch the pipe, hoping to knock free whatever was blocking it. The pole hit something. She pulled. Snow and ice cascaded down, some of it falling into the entry throat, some of it disappearing into the white. She pulled the door closed and sealed it again. Inside, the smoke was beginning to thin. The draft was drawing again. She had cleared the chimney. She had no idea how long it would stay clear. The third hour brought visitors. Maren heard the pounding before she understood what it was. A sound that was not wind, not creaking wood, not the hiss of snow against sod. A rhythm, a pattern. Someone was hitting the outer door. She crawled through the entry throat and put her ear against the wood. The pounding came again, weaker now. "Help!" A voice she almost recognized. "Please, help!" She pulled the door open. Lute Jessen fell through the gap and collapsed on the floor of the entry throat. In his arms, wrapped in a blanket that was more ice than cloth, was a small body. His son, the youngest, maybe 4 years old. "The shed," Jessen gasped. "The canvas, it tore. We couldn't. Get inside. Now." She dragged them both through the entry throat and into the main chamber. Jessen was ice from head to foot, his lips blue, his fingers locked in a grip around his son that would not release. The boy was not moving. Maren pried Jessen's fingers loose. She stripped the frozen clothing from the child and pressed her hand against his chest. A heartbeat. Faint, irregular, but there. "Ragna! Move!" Her daughter slid off the sleeping shelf, making room. Maren placed Jessen's boy where Ragna had been, wrapping him in the blankets that still held warmth from her daughter's body. She placed hot stones from beside the stove against his core, his armpits, his groin, anywhere the blood ran close to the surface. "Is he alive?" Jessen's voice was barely audible. He was sitting against the wall, unable to stand, unable to do anything but watch. "He's alive. Stay still. My wife, my other children. Where are they?" "The house. The sod house. I thought they'd be safer. I took him to check the stock. The shed." His voice broke. "I couldn't see. I walked in circles. I don't know how long. Then I saw your smoke." Smoke? The chimney she had cleared was still drawing. The smoke was still rising. In a storm that erased everything, the smoke had been a beacon. "Your wife knows to stay inside?" Yes, she knows." "Then she'll stay. You can't help her now. You can barely help yourself." Jessen closed his eyes. Snow melted from his clothes and pooled on the earthen floor. The night lasted forever. Maren lost track of time. There was no day and no night, only the wind, only the cold, only the fire that demanded constant feeding, only the children who needed warming and the man who had nearly died finding them. Jessen's boy woke in the 4th hour. His name was Thomas. He cried for his mother and would not stop until exhaustion took him. Jessen sat beside him on the sleeping shelf, holding his hand, saying nothing. Ragna helped where she could. She fed chips and scraps into the stove when Maren could not leave the sick. She melted snow for water. She shared her blankets with Thomas without complaint. Eli's cough grew worse as the night deepened. The cold and the smoke and the stress had combined to rack her small body. Maren held her between fits, feeling the heat of fever beneath the cold of the room. The temperature outside dropped so far that the moisture in the air inside the shelter began to freeze on the walls. Frost crept across the sod like white mold. The wagon bed creaked and groaned above them, protesting weight Maren could not see and could not clear. She waited for the sound of breaking wood. It did not come. The snow wall Grindheim had helped her build was doing its work. The wind hit the wall, rose, and passed over the shelter instead of driving snow directly onto the crown. The drift was building behind the wall instead of on top of the wagon bed. But the wall was also disappearing, buried, covered. Soon there would be no wall, and the wind would find the shelter again. Grindheim arrived sometime in the darkest part of the night. Maren did not hear him until he was already in the entry throat, banging ice from his coat, his face so windburned that he barely looked human. He carried 2 armloads of fuel, twisted grass, dried dung. a few precious sticks of actual wood. "Chimney's clogging again," he said, as if arriving in a killing blizzard were perfectly normal. "I cleared it on my way in." "How did you find us?" "Followed the rope." He set down the fuel. "I strung a line from my place to the tanner's old claim last fall, in case." "In case of what?" "In case of this." He looked at the crowd in the shelter. Martin, her 2 daughters, Jessen and his boy. 5 people in a space built for 3. "You're burning too fast. You need to bank the fire lower. Let the bodies do more of the work." "If I bank it lower, the children will freeze." "If you burn through your fuel, everyone will freeze." He crouched beside the stove and began adjusting the damper. "The trick is knowing what winter can steal first. Right now it wants your fuel. Don't give it more than you have to." He stayed for an hour. He checked the draft, checked the seals, checked the weight on the crown by listening to the creaks and groans of the wagon bed. When he left, he took nothing with him. "Keep them alive until dawn," he said from the entry throat. "The worst should pass by then." Then he was gone, crawling back out into the white. Dawn did not come. What came instead was a gradual lightening of the white, a sense that somewhere beyond the howling wall of snow, the sun might still exist. The wind slowed. The temperature impossibly rose from killing cold to merely dangerous cold, from 40 below to 20 below to somewhere near 0. Marin opened the outer door and looked out. The world had been remade. The snow wall was gone, buried under a drift that rose 6 feet high against the northern edge of the shelter. The entry throat opened into a canyon of white, with walls of packed snow on either side. Beyond that, the prairie had become a single unbroken expanse of white, featureless as a blank page. But the shelter stood. The wagon bed had not collapsed. The sod banking had not torn away. The chimney still rose from the crown, still drawing, still trailing thin smoke into the gray morning air. Marin crawled back inside and looked at what remained. Jessen's boy was sleeping, his color returning, his breathing even. Jessen sat beside him, awake, staring at the wall. Ragna was awake too, watching Marin with eyes that looked older than 8 years. Eli was the worst. Her fever had spiked in the night. She lay on the shelf, barely conscious, her breathing shallow and fast, her skin hot to the touch. They had survived the storm. But surviving the night did not mean surviving the winter. The fuel was nearly gone. Marin counted what remained in the gray light of morning: half a bundle of twisted grass, a double handful of dried chips, 3 sticks of wood no longer than her forearm, maybe 8 hours of careful burning, maybe 12 if she let the temperature drop to the edge of danger. Outside, the temperature was still well below 0. The wind had died, but the cold had not. Moving would be possible. Finding fuel would be possible. Warming the shelter again would take everything they had left. She looked at the stove. She looked at her daughters. She looked at Jessen, who had nearly died finding this place, and at his son, who would certainly have died without it. They had made it through the night. That was more than many would be able to say. The first visitor came in the early afternoon, a man on foot, struggling through drifts that reached his waist, his face wrapped against the cold. Marin watched him approach from the mouth of the entry throat, her hand on the door, ready to close it if he meant harm. He stopped at the edge of the snowdrift and stared at what he saw. "Mrs. Haugen?" "Yes." "I'm looking for Lute Jessen. His wife said he went to check the stock and never came back. Someone saw smoke from your chimney. They said if anyone was still alive out here." "He's inside. His boy too." The man, a neighbor Marin did not recognize, stood in the snow and stared at the shelter as if he could not quite believe what he was seeing. "That's your place? That buried thing?" "That's my place." "And they're alive in there?" "Everyone who made it inside is alive." The man shook his head slowly. He looked at the chimney, at the steam rising from the entry throat, at the impossible fact of survival, where survival should not have existed. "I'll tell his wife," he said. She thought he was dead. Everyone thought, "Tell her he'll be home when the boy can walk. Another day, maybe 2. The man nodded. He started to turn away, then stopped. Mrs. Haugen, that storm, the Andersons' place collapsed. The soddy on the ridge. 3 of their children didn't make it. Marin said nothing. There was nothing to say. Your place held. Yes. How? She looked at the wagon bed, barely visible under its coat of snow and sod. The curved crown that shed weight, the low walls that trapped heat, the small space that kept them all alive when larger spaces had become tombs. I built for the weather I had, she said, not the house I wished for. The man nodded again, though she was not sure he understood. Then he turned and began the long walk back through the snow. By evening, Jessen was well enough to help. They dug out together, Marin, Jessen, and Ragna, clearing snow from the entry throat, finding the buried woodpile, salvaging fuel that had been preserved under the drift. The work was exhausting, and the cold bit at every exposed inch of skin, but the work was also necessary. When they stopped at dusk, the shelter was functional again. The fire burned steady. The draft drew clean. The walls stood solid. Inside, Eli's fever had broken. She was sleeping normally now, her breathing slow and even, her skin cool to the touch. Thomas was sitting up, asking for food, acting like a child who had not come within hours of freezing to death. Jessen sat beside the stove and looked at the space around him. The earthen walls, the wagon bed ceiling, the sod banking that had held against a storm that destroyed sod houses. I said a wagon carries grain, he said. I said it wouldn't keep winter out. You did. I was wrong. He looked at Marin. This thing you built, it shouldn't have worked. Every piece of logic I know says it should have failed, but it didn't. It almost did. More than once. But it didn't. He stood slowly, his body still aching from the night before. When I can walk properly again, I want you to show me how you built it. The angles, the seals, the way you set the snow wall. I want to know everything. Why? Because I have 3 children who almost lost their father last night, and because there are others who lost more than that. He moved toward the entry throat. Whatever you did here, it works. People should know. He crawled out into the cold. Marin heard him crunching through the snow, heading home to a wife who thought she was a widow. She stayed by the stove, feeding it chips, watching her daughters sleep. Outside, the prairie stretched white and silent under a sky that had tried to kill them all. The buried wagon had held. The thaw came slowly, and with it came the counting of the dead. 17 people in Custer County had not survived the blizzard of January 12th. 3 of them were children. 2 were men who had gone to check livestock and never returned. The rest were scattered across the prairie in sod houses that collapsed, in shanties that blew apart, in shelters that were not shelters at all. Marin heard the numbers from visitors who came to see the thing that had held. They came in 1s and 2s at first, neighbors, acquaintances, people she barely recognized. They stood at the edge of the snowdrift and stared at the wagon bed rising from the earth like the spine of some buried creature. They asked questions. They walked the perimeter. They crouched at the entry throat and peered inside. How deep did you dig? How thick is the sod? Where did you get that wagon bed? Marin answered them all. She showed them the angles of the snow wall, now buried and useless but soon to be rebuilt. She showed them the clay-packed chimney collar, the entry throat that broke the wind, the low ceiling that trapped heat. She did not charge for the knowledge. She did not hoard it. What she had built was not a secret. It was a survival technique that anyone could copy if they understood the principles. The question was whether anyone would. Elias Brome came on the 3rd day after the storm. He rode the same dun mare, but he looked different now, older, smaller. The storm had taken something from him too, though Marin did not know what. He dismounted at the snowdrift and stood looking at the shelter for a long time. Marin waited in the entry throat, watching him. She did not speak first. The Andersons, he said finally. You heard? I heard. 3 children. The roof came down in the night. They were in bed when it happened. He looked at her. Good sod house. Better than most. I helped them build the frame myself. I'm sorry. Don't be sorry, be right. He walked closer, studying the wagon bed, the sod banking, the chimney that still trailed thin smoke. I told you this contraption would smother your girls. I told you the first hard blow would bury them. You did. I was wrong. The words came hard, like stones pulled from frozen ground. I've been building shelters on these plains for 15 years. I thought I knew what winter could do. I thought I knew what would hold and what wouldn't. But this, he gestured at the shelter, this held when proper houses didn't. I don't understand it, but I can't argue with it either. It's not complicated. Small space, low ceiling, earth on every side. The wagon bed sheds weight instead of catching it. The snow wall breaks the drift before it loads the roof. I know what you did. I've been looking at it for 10 minutes. What I don't understand is how you knew to do it. Maren considered the question. How had she known? She had not known. She had guessed. She had calculated. She had remembered things her grandmother said about stone huts in Norway, things Grindheim had taught her about draft and weight, things she had figured out herself by watching how snow moved and heat escaped. I built for what I had, she said. Not for what I wished I had. Brome nodded slowly. He reached into his coat and pulled out a folded piece of paper. The county is putting together a list, he said. Families who need help rebuilding. Families who lost everything. I told them about your place. I told them what held and what didn't. He handed her the paper. They want to know if you'd be willing to show others. Help them build something that won't kill them next time. Maren unfolded the paper. A list of names, 8 families. Some she recognized, some she did not. I'm not a builder. Neither were they. That's why they need you. She looked at the list again. 8 families. 8 chances for someone else to survive what she had survived. I'll need help, she said. Greenheim? If he's willing. Brome almost smiled. It was the first time she had seen anything like warmth on his face. He's willing. I asked him this morning. He gathered his reins. Start with the Lindgrens. Young couple, new baby, nothing but canvas over their heads right now. They're the most desperate. He mounted and rode away. Maren stood in the cold, holding the list, feeling the weight of what had just been asked of her. The Lindgrens lived 4 miles east in a draw that offered no shelter from the north wind. Maren walked there with Ragna, leaving Eli in Greenheim's care. The old man had appeared at the shelter that morning without explanation, as he always did, and had simply nodded when Maren said she needed to go. The girl will be fine, he said. Go teach. The Lindgren claim was worse than Maren had expected. The canvas tent they had been living in had shredded in the blizzard, leaving nothing but poles and frozen scraps. Eric Lindgren, barely 22, was trying to rig a replacement from blankets and salvaged cloth. His wife, Petra, sat inside the makeshift structure nursing an infant that could not have been more than 3 months old. Mrs. Haugen, Eric's voice cracked with exhaustion. Mr. Brome said you might come. He said you built something that held. I did. Can you show us? Please. The baby Petra hasn't slept in days. She's terrified. We both are. If another storm comes, another storm will come. That's why we need to work fast. Maren walked the claim with Eric, studying the terrain the way Grindheim had taught her. The draw offered some protection, but the angle was wrong. Wind would funnel through instead of passing over. They needed to shift the shelter site 20 yards west, where a low ridge would break the worst of the gusts. Here, she said. Dig here. 8 feet by 10 feet, no more. Keep it small. Small heats fast. But the baby, we need room. You need warmth more than you need room. A big space with a frozen baby is worse than a small space with a warm one. Eric stared at her. He was not arguing. He was calculating the way Maren had calculated all those months ago. We don't have a wagon bed, he said. You don't need one. You need a roof that sheds weight and a structure that doesn't catch wind. Sod can do that if you build it right. Poles can do it if you angle them. What do you have? Some lumber, not much. Some sod cut before the storm. Show me. They worked until dark. Maren showed Eric how to cut sod at angles for interlocking courses, how to bank earth against the sides for insulation, how to frame a low roof that would shed snow instead of collecting it. Petra watched from the ruined tent, the baby quiet against her chest. When Maren left, the foundation was dug, and the first courses were laid. It was not finished. It would not be finished for days. But it was started, and started was more than they had that morning. "How can we repay you?" Eric asked. "Teach someone else when you know how. That's repayment enough." The pattern repeated through the rest of January. Maren visited the families on Brome's list one by one, walking miles through snow that reached her knees, teaching what she knew to people who had nothing. A bachelor claim holder whose shack had blown open, a widow with 3 sons and no husband to do the heavy lifting. A German family who spoke little English but understood angles and weight when Maren drew them in the dirt. Each family was different. Each site had different constraints, but the principles remained the same. Dig low, build small, bank earth against the walls, angle the roof to shed weight, break the wind before it reaches the structure. Some of them had materials Maren could not have imagined using. The bachelor used machinery boards from a broken harvester. The German family had access to stone from a nearby outcrop. The widow with 3 sons enlisted her boys to cut and stack sod in a pattern Maren devised specifically for their terrain. Not all of them succeeded equally. One family ignored her drainage warnings and built in a low spot that would flood in spring. Another loaded their roof too heavy on the center span, and Maren had to return twice to show them how to redistribute the weight. But none of them died. When the next storm came in early February, smaller than the blizzard, but still deadly, every family on Brome's list survived. Maren heard about it from Grindheim, who had made his own rounds to check on them. "The Lindgren baby is still alive," he said. "Petra says the shelter held heat better than anything they've ever lived in." "Good." The bachelor, what's his name, Hendricks, he's already talking about improvements, wants to add a second room in the spring. "He should focus on drainage first. That site will flood." Grindheim looked at her with something that might have been pride, or might have been amusement, or might have been both. "You're thinking like a builder now." "I'm thinking like someone who's made mistakes and doesn't want others to repeat them." "That's the same thing." Silas Vorn did not visit the shelter. He did not walk the perimeter or ask questions about angles and drainage. He did not acknowledge that the buried wagon had held when his predictions said it would fail. What he did was talk. Maren heard about it from Lute Jessen, who came by in mid-February to thank her properly for saving his son. "Your Vorn's been telling people you got lucky," Jessen said. "He says the blizzard wasn't as bad as everyone claims. He says your shelter would have collapsed if the wind had shifted another 10 degrees. He says anyone who copies your design is a fool." Does anyone believe him? Some do. The ones who haven't seen what you built. The ones who'd rather trust a man in a town coat than a widow with dirt under her nails. Jessen shook his head. But fewer every day. Word spreads. People talk about what held and what didn't. Vorn can say whatever he wants, but he can't argue with 17 dead and a shelter that's still standing. He's afraid. Of what? Of being irrelevant. Maren understood Vorn's position better than she wanted to. He had built his business on people's desperation, selling them supplies they could not afford, buying claims from those who failed. If people stopped failing, Vorn stopped profiting. He needs people to believe they can't survive without what he sells. And you're showing them they can survive with what they already have. I'm showing them what's possible. Whether they believe it is up to them. Jessen was quiet for a moment. Then he reached into his coat and pulled out a small leather pouch. "I owe you for my boy's life. That's a debt I can't properly repay, but I can do this." He handed her the pouch. Inside were coins. Maren counted them by feel without removing them. "This is too much. It's not enough, but it's what I have." He stood to leave. "Use it for materials, for the families who can't afford to build, for whatever you need. Thomas is alive because you opened that door. The least I can do is help you open more doors for others." Grindheim grew sick in late February. Maren noticed it first in his breathing, a rattle that had not been there before, a pause between words where he gathered strength to continue. He denied it when she asked. He kept working, kept teaching, kept appearing at her shelter to check the draft and the seals and the weight on the crown. But he moved slower. He coughed more. He stopped making the 2-mile walk from his soddy and started staying overnight, sleeping on the floor of the entry throat because there was no room inside. "You need rest," Marin told him. "Rest is for the dead. I'll rest when I'm finished." Finished with what? He did not answer. But he kept coming back, day after day, helping her teach the families who sought her out, showing her techniques she had not learned yet. He taught her how to read the spring thaw, which banks would flood, which would drain, which would turn to mud that swallowed everything. He taught her how to cut emergency drainage trenches before the water rose. He taught her how to recognize the signs of soil saturation that meant a shelter was about to become a death trap. "The cold kills fast," he said. "The water kills slow. People forget that. They survive the blizzard and then drown in the spring because they didn't think about where the melt would go. Did you learn that the hard way?" "I learned everything the hard way. There's no other way to learn out here." They were sitting outside her shelter, watching the sun set over a prairie that was finally beginning to show patches of brown through the white. Inside, the girls were sleeping. The fire was banked low. The world was quiet in a way it had not been quiet for months. "Why did you help me?" Marin asked. "That first day. You said you don't help anyone, but you came back." Grindheim was silent for a long time. When he spoke, his voice was different, softer, older, more tired than she had ever heard it. "I had a daughter once." Marin waited. She was 7 when the fever took her, 1859. "I was working a freight run to North Platte, 3 days from home. By the time I got back, she was buried." He coughed, a wet sound that ended in a wheeze. "My wife left after that. Said she couldn't look at me without seeing the empty bed. Said I loved the road more than I loved my family. Maybe she was right. I'm sorry." "Don't be sorry. Be something better." He looked at her. "When I saw what you were building, that ugly thing, that desperate thing, I saw someone fighting the way I should have fought. I saw someone refusing to give up when giving up would have been easier. I thought, if I help her, maybe it means something. Maybe it makes up for the fights I didn't fight when I should have. Does it? I don't know. Ask me when I'm dead." He coughed again, harder this time. "Which might be sooner than I'd like." Grindheim collapsed on the morning of March 3rd. Marin found him in the entry throat, curled on his side, barely breathing. She dragged him inside and laid him on the sleeping shelf where her daughters usually slept. His skin was gray, his lips were blue. His eyes, when they opened, had a faraway look that frightened her more than the cold ever had. "The drainage," he whispered. "At the Hoffman place. Did you check it?" "I'll check it later." "Check it now. The thaw's coming. If they didn't dig the trenches deep enough, I'll check it. Rest now." He closed his eyes. Marin sat beside him, holding his hand, feeling the bones beneath the skin. He had been old when she met him. He had become ancient in the months since. She thought about what he had told her. The daughter. The wife. The years of freight runs and winter survival and living alone in a soddy that he had built for a family that no longer existed. She thought about what it meant to keep going when everything you loved was gone. She thought about Ola, buried on the rise where the wind never stopped. "Grindheim." His eyes opened. "Thank you. For everything." He almost smiled. It was the first time she had seen him smile without bitterness. "Build for the weather you have," he said. "Not the house you wish for. Remember that." "I'll remember." "Good." He closed his eyes again. "Good." He died 3 days later, in the early hours before dawn. Marin was awake when it happened. She had been awake for most of the 3 days, sleeping in snatches, watching his breathing grow shallower and more irregular. When it finally stopped, she sat beside him for a long time, not moving, not crying, just sitting with the silence. She buried him beside Ola on the rise where the wind never stopped. The girls helped dig the grave. The ground was soft now, thawed enough to accept a shovel. They did not speak as they worked. There was nothing to say. Grindheim had been a stranger who became a teacher, who became something closer to family. Now he was gone, and the world was smaller without him. Maren did not cry at the burial. She had no tears left. What she had instead was knowledge, everything he had taught her, everything he had shown her, everything she had learned by watching him work. That was his legacy. That was what he had left behind. After the grave was filled, she stood on the rise and looked out over the prairie. The snow was melting. The grass was beginning to show through. The worst of the winter was over, but spring brought its own dangers, and somewhere out there, families who had survived the blizzard were about to face the thaw. The Hoffman place flooded on March 9th. Maren had checked their drainage trenches 3 days earlier and found them adequate. What she had not anticipated was the ice dam, a wall of frozen runoff that had built up in the draw above their shelter, invisible under the snow, waiting for the thaw to release it. The water came down in the middle of the night. The Hoffmans, a father, mother, and 2 small children, woke to find their shelter filling with ice-cold meltwater that rose to their knees in minutes. Maren heard about it from Brome, who rode to her shelter at dawn. "They're alive," he said. "Barely, but the shelter is gone. Flooded out, walls collapsed, everything they owned soaked or frozen. They've got nothing." "Where are they now?" "Lindgren's place. It's crowded, but it's dry." Maren was already gathering her tools. The shovel Ola had used, the clay trowel she had made herself, the length of rope Grindheim had given her. "I need to see the site." "Why? It's destroyed." "I need to understand what happened, so it doesn't happen again." The Hoffman site was a disaster. The shelter Maren had helped them build was now a pit full of muddy water. The sod walls had slumped inward. The roof, a pole frame covered with earth, had collapsed completely. Everything the family had owned was either submerged or scattered across the muddy slope where the water had carried it. Maren walked the terrain, tracing the path the water had taken. The ice dam had built up in a narrow spot upstream, fed by snowmelt from the higher ground. When the dam broke, the water had nowhere to go except downhill directly into the shelter. She had not seen it. She had checked the trenches and thought they were adequate, but she had not walked the full drainage path. She had not looked for ice dams. She had not anticipated what spring could do when winter finally let go. Grindheim would have seen it. Grindheim would have known to look. But Grindheim was dead, and Maren was alone, and the Hoffmans had lost everything because she had not known enough. She rebuilt the Hoffman shelter in a different location. Higher ground this time. Better drainage. A site where water would flow around the structure instead of through it. She enlisted the Lindgren boy and Jessen's oldest son to help with the digging, paying them with the coins Jessen had given her. The work took a week. The Hoffmans stayed at the Lindgren place, crowded and uncomfortable but alive. When the new shelter was finished, smaller than before but better positioned, they moved in with nothing but the clothes on their backs and a debt they could not repay. "We can't afford to pay you," Mr. Hoffman said. "I don't want payment. I want you to help the next family who needs it." "What if there is no next family?" "There's always a next family. Out here, there's always someone who needs help." The word spread faster after the Hoffman flood. People began to understand that surviving the blizzard was only half the battle. The spring thaw was equally dangerous, quieter, slower, but just as deadly. Families who had built in low spots found their shelters filling with water. Families who had ignored drainage found their walls crumbling as the ground turned to mud. They came to Maren. At first it was 1 or 2 at a time, a farmer with questions about trench depth, a widow who wanted to know where to dig a sump, a young man who had seen the Hoffman flood and wanted to make sure his own place was safe. Then it was groups, families who had heard about the Norwegian widow who built shelters that survived blizzards and helped people avoid floods, people who had been told by Silas Vorn that she was lucky, that her methods were foolish, that anyone who trusted her was a fool, and who had come anyway because luck and foolishness had kept her daughters alive when proper houses had killed children. Maren taught them what Greentime had taught her. She showed them how to read the terrain, how to trace drainage paths, how to identify the signs of future flooding before the water rose. She showed them the techniques she had developed herself, the entry throat, the snow wall, the weight distribution that kept the wagon bed from collapsing. She did not claim to have all the answers. She made mistakes. She learned from them. She shared what she learned with everyone who asked. "You're becoming famous," Rachna said one evening, as another family departed after a day of instruction. "I'm not famous, I'm just useful." "What's the difference?" Maren thought about it. "Famous means people know your name. Useful means people know what you can do. I'd rather be useful." Papa was useful. He worked hard every day, but nobody came to ask him questions. "Your father worked for us. I'm working for everyone." She pulled her daughter close. "There's room for both kinds of work, but right now this is what I can do. This is how I can make sure what happened to the Andersons' children doesn't happen to anyone else." Ragna was quiet for a moment. Then she said, "Eli wants to learn too. She says she's old enough to help." "Eli is 5. She says she can carry clay and mix mortar. She says she watched you do it all winter." Maren looked toward the shelter, where Eli was sitting in the entry throat, watching the sunset. "Tell her she can start tomorrow, small jobs only, and she stops the moment her cough comes back." Ragna ran to deliver the message. Maren watched her go, feeling something she had not felt in months. Hope. Fragile and uncertain, but real. Silas Vorn made his move in late March. Maren heard about it from Brome, who rode to her shelter with a face like thunder. "Vorn's been talking to the county commissioners," he said. "He's telling them your shelters are dangerous. He's saying the Hoffman flood proves it. He's asking them to issue a warning against what he calls substandard frontier construction." "The Hoffman flood happened because I missed an ice dam. It had nothing to do with the shelter design." "I know that. You know that. But Vorn is telling a different story. He's saying your methods are untested, that you're putting people at risk, that the county should recommend proper construction methods instead of his words, Norwegian badger holes." Maren felt anger rise in her chest. She had taught a dozen families. She had helped rebuild the Hoffman place with her own hands. She had done everything she could to share what she knew, and Vorn was trying to destroy it because it threatened his profits. "What do the commissioners say?" "They're listening. Vorn has money. Vorn has influence. Vorn has been here longer than you have and knows how to make people trust him." Brome shook his head. "If he convinces them to issue a warning, people will stop coming to you. They'll go back to building the same structures that failed in the blizzard. And next winter, more people will die." "Yes." Maren stood in silence, thinking. She could argue with the commissioners. She could show them the shelters that had held, the families that had survived, the principles that worked. But Vorn had money and influence, and she had neither. Vorn had been here longer, and she was still a newcomer. Vorn had credibility as a businessman, and she was just a widow who had gotten lucky, if you believed his version of the story. "I need to talk to him," she said. Vorn? He won't listen. He'll listen if I have something he wants." "What could you possibly have that Silas Vorn wants?" Maren thought about it. She thought about Vorn's business, the supplies he sold, the claims he bought, the credit he extended to desperate settlers. She thought about what he feared and what he valued and what he needed to protect. "Customers," she said. "He wants customers, and right now, I'm teaching people to survive without buying what he sells." So maybe I stop teaching them to survive without him. Maybe I start teaching them to survive with him on different terms. Brome stared at her. "You'd make a deal with Vorn?" "I'd make a deal with the devil if it kept families alive." She gathered her coat. "Where is he?" "His store, same place he always is, counting money and spreading poison." "Good. I'll go count with him." Silas Vorn's store sat at the main crossroads of Broken Bow, a wooden building that had survived 3 winters without damage because Vorn had money to build it properly. Maren walked there alone, leaving the girls with Jessen's wife. The walk took 2 hours. By the time she reached the store, her feet were numb and her determination was iron. Vorn was behind the counter when she entered, arranging jars of nails on a shelf. He looked up at the sound of the door, and his expression shifted from merchant's welcome to wary recognition. "Mrs. Haugen, I didn't expect to see you here." "I imagine not." She walked to the counter and stood across from him, the wooden surface between them like a negotiating table. "You've been talking to the county commissioners." "I've been sharing concerns, legitimate concerns about public safety." "You've been lying to protect your profits." Vorn's eyes narrowed. "Careful, Mrs. Haugen. Accusations like that can have consequences. So can warnings from the county. If people stop building shelters that work, they'll die. And they'll die because you're afraid of losing money. I'm afraid of settlers being misled by untested methods from someone with no credentials. The Hoffman flood. The Hoffman flood happened because I made a mistake. I've learned from it. Every shelter I've helped build since then has proper drainage. Every family who's come to me since then knows how to read the thaw. I'm not perfect, Mr. Vorn, but I'm trying to help people survive. What are you trying to do?" Vorn was silent for a moment. Then he leaned forward, his voice dropping. "What do you want, Mrs. Haugen?" "I want you to withdraw your complaint to the commissioners." "And in exchange?" "In exchange, I stop teaching people to survive without your store. I start telling them what they need to buy from you, proper materials, quality supplies, the things that make the difference between a shelter that holds and one that doesn't. I become your advertisement instead of your competition." Vorn studied her. She could see him calculating, weighing the value of the deal against the cost of accepting it. "You'd do that, after everything I've said about you?" "I'd do anything to keep families alive, including making a deal with a man I don't trust." She held his gaze. "But I have conditions. You stop spreading lies about my methods. You stop trying to undermine what I'm building. And when people come to your store asking about winter shelters, you send them to me. That's a lot to ask. It's less than I could ask. I could fight you publicly. I could tell everyone what you've been doing and why. I could make you the villain in a story about dead children and a man who cared more about money than lives. Is that what you want?" Vorn was quiet for a long time. Then, slowly, he smiled. It was not a warm smile. It was the smile of a man who recognized a worthy opponent. "You're more dangerous than I thought, Mrs. Haugen. I'm a mother with 2 daughters and no husband. Dangerous is the only thing I can afford to be." He extended his hand. "We have a deal. I'll withdraw the complaint. You'll recommend my store, and we'll see how this arrangement works for both of us." Marin shook his hand. It was cold and dry, like shaking hands with a snake. "Pleasure doing business with you, Mr. Vorn." "Likewise, Mrs. Haugen, likewise." She walked home in the gathering dark, her mind turning over what she had done. She had made a deal with a man who had tried to destroy her. She had compromised with someone whose values she despised. She had traded her independence for survival, not her own survival, but the survival of her ability to help others. Grindheim would have understood. Grindheim had survived for decades by knowing when to fight and when to negotiate. He had taught her to read terrain and build shelters and anticipate the thaw. But he had also taught her something else, something she was only now beginning to understand. The trick is knowing what winter can steal first. Vorn could have stolen her influence. He could have turned the commissioners against her. He could have made her a pariah, a cautionary tale, a widow who got lucky once and convinced others to die trying to repeat it. Instead, she had stolen his attack before he could launch it. She had turned an enemy into a reluctant ally. She had bought herself time to keep teaching, keep building, keep spreading what she knew. It was not a victory. It was a trade-off. Everything on the plains was a trade-off, but her daughters were alive. The families she had taught were alive. And next winter, maybe more families would survive because of what she had learned. That was enough. It had to be enough. She reached the shelter after dark, guided by the smoke rising from the chimney. Ragna and Eli were inside, warm and safe, tending a fire that would last through the night. Maren stood outside for a moment, looking at what she had built. The wagon bed still solid after everything the winter had thrown at it. The snow wall now melting but soon to be rebuilt. The entry throat, the earthen walls, the chimney that Grindheim had helped her make safe. It was ugly. It was desperate. It was not what anyone else would build, but it had held. She crawled through the entry throat and into the warmth, and her daughters wrapped their arms around her, and for a moment nothing else mattered. Spring turned to summer. Summer turned to fall. The prairie remembered what it was before winter had buried it. Grass and wind, an endless sky stretching to horizons that never came closer. Maren's shelter survived its first full year. The wagon bed had settled into the earth like it had always been there. The sod banking had grown over with grass, blurring the line between shelter and prairie. The entry throat had been improved twice, once after the spring thaw revealed gaps in the seal, once after Maren realized she could add a small storage niche along the passage. The snow wall had been rebuilt, stronger than before, angled to break the winter wind that would come again. Inside, the space had become something close to home. Ragna had claimed one corner of the sleeping shelf as her own, marking it with a piece of embroidered cloth that had survived from Norway. Eli had recovered fully from her winter illness, and now spent her days helping Maren with whatever work needed doing, mixing clay, cutting sod, measuring angles with a stick and a piece of string. The claim was no longer just a piece of paper. It was theirs. The visitors kept coming, not as many as in the desperate weeks after the blizzard, but steady. A family from 2 counties over who had heard about the Norwegian widow and her shelters. A man from Broken Bow who wanted to learn drainage techniques before building on a questionable site. A woman whose husband had died in the February storm and who needed to know if she could survive on her own. Maren taught them all. She walked their sites, studied their terrain, showed them what she knew. She made mistakes sometimes, missed a drainage path, misjudged a roof angle, but she learned from each one and shared what she learned with the next person who came. The phrase spread with the teaching: build for the weather you have, not the house you wish for. Grindheim's words, carried forward by everyone who heard them. Maren did not claim credit. She just kept saying them, kept teaching them, kept watching them take root in minds that needed to hear them. By the second fall, she had helped build or advise on 23 shelters across Custer County. Not all of them were wagon beds over dugouts. Most families had different materials, different sites, different constraints, but all of them shared the same principles: low ceilings, earth banking, proper drainage, roofs that shed weight instead of collecting it. 23 shelters. 23 families who might survive what was coming. Anders Moen arrived in October of 1888, when the first frost was already on the ground. He came walking from the east with a carpenter's toolkit over his shoulder and nothing else. He was 34 years old, Norwegian-born like Maren, with hands that knew wood and eyes that knew loss. His wife had died in childbirth 2 years before. His son had died with her. He had spent the time since then drifting from job to job, building for other people because he could not bear to build for himself. He found Maren's claim by accident. He had been looking for work in Broken Bow and had heard about the widow who built shelters. He had come to see if she needed a carpenter. "I don't have money to pay you," Maren said when he explained what he wanted. "I don't need money. I need work." He looked at the shelter, at the wagon bed rising from the earth, at the entry throat and the snow wall and the chimney trailing smoke. "That's a strange thing you've built there." "It works. I can see that." He walked around the perimeter, the way Brome had walked around it almost a year before. But where Brome had looked with skepticism, Moen looked with curiosity. "The weight distribution is clever. The curve sheds snow better than a flat roof would, but the joints—" He crouched at one corner, examining the place where wagon bed met earthen wall. "The joints are weak. You're losing heat here and here." He pointed to a second spot. "This could be sealed better, properly framed." "I know. I didn't have the skills to do it properly." "I do." He stood and faced her. "I'll work for food and a place to sleep, nothing more. And I'll fix what needs fixing." Maren studied him. She had learned to read people over the past year who was desperate, who was dangerous, who was genuine. Anders Moen looked like a man who had stopped running and was ready to stand still. The entry throat has a storage niche, she said. You can sleep there if you don't mind the cold. I've slept in worse. Then we have a deal. He started work the next morning. The joints took 3 days to repair. Moen worked with a precision Maren had never seen, measuring twice, cutting once, fitting boards together so tightly that a knife blade would not pass between them. He did not talk while he worked. He did not need to. His hands said everything. When the joints were done, he moved to the roof. The wagon bed had developed a slight bow over the summer, the wood settling under the weight of the sod. Moen cut support braces from salvaged lumber and fitted them beneath the curve, redistributing the load so the bow straightened. You're making it stronger, Ragnar said, watching him work. I'm making it last. He looked at her. Your mother built something that survived. My job is to make sure it keeps surviving. For how long? As long as someone is willing to maintain it. He drove a nail with 3 precise strikes. Buildings don't fail because they're weak. They fail because people stop caring for them. Your mother cares. That's why this one is still standing. Ragnar thought about that for a moment. Then she asked, Will you teach me? Moen stopped working. He looked at the girl, 8 years old, thin, with her mother's stubborn jaw and her father's curious eyes. Teach you what? Carpentry. How to measure and cut and make things that last. He almost smiled. It was the first time Maren had seen anything close to warmth on his face. Ask your mother. Ragnar ran to ask. Maren said yes, and from that day on, Ragnar spent her mornings learning carpentry while Eli learned the earth and clay work that Maren had mastered. The second winter came hard and fast. The first real storm hit in early December, a 3-day blow that buried the prairie under 2 feet of snow. Maren's shelter held without complaint. The repairs Moen had made kept the heat in and the cold out. The snow wall broke the drift before it could load the roof. The drainage trenches, dug deeper after the Hoffman lesson, channeled meltwater away from the walls. 21 of the 23 shelters Maren had helped build that year also held. 2 failed, one because the family had ignored her warnings about roof weight, one because the site flooded despite what she thought was adequate drainage. Both families survived. Neither family blamed Maren. You can't save everyone, Moen said after the second failure. They were sitting in the entry throat, watching the snow fall, the children asleep inside. You can only teach. What they do with the teaching is up to them. I know, but knowing doesn't make it easier. Nothing makes it easier. You just learn to carry it. She looked at him. He was staring at the snow, his face unreadable, and she understood suddenly that he was not just talking about shelters. He was talking about the wife he had lost, the son who had never taken a breath, the weight he had been carrying for 2 years. How do you carry it? She asked. One day at a time, one job at a time, one nail at a time. He turned to face her. You find something worth building. You put your hands to work. And eventually, the weight becomes part of you instead of something you're dragging behind. Is that why you came here? To find something worth building? I came here because I heard about a woman who built something impossible. I wanted to see if it was true. He paused. It was true. And now I want to help build more impossible things. They sat in silence for a while, watching the snow. Then Maren reached out and put her hand over his, and he did not pull away. Silas Vorn's reckoning came in January of 1889. He had kept his word after their deal, withdrawn the complaint, stopped spreading lies, even sent customers to Maren when they asked about winter shelters. But he had never believed. Maren could see it in his eyes every time they met. He was waiting for her methods to fail, waiting for a disaster that would prove him right. The disaster came, but not the way he expected. Vorn had been traveling back from North Platte when the storm hit, a fast-moving blizzard that dropped visibility to nothing in minutes. His horse panicked and bolted. Vorn was thrown. By the time he got his bearings, he was alone on the prairie with the temperature dropping and the wind screaming and no shelter in sight. He walked. He had no choice. He walked until his legs gave out, until his hands were frozen inside his gloves, until he could barely see the snow in front of his face. And then he saw smoke, a thin trail of it, rising from what looked like a mound of earth. A shelter. A Marin-style shelter built by a family she had taught the previous year. Vorn crawled to the entry throat and pounded on the door with frozen fists. The family, a German couple with 2 young children, pulled him inside and wrapped him in blankets and fed him broth until his color came back. He spent 2 days in that shelter, waiting for the storm to pass. 2 days in a low-ceilinged, earth-banked space that he had called a badger hole. 2 days surviving because someone had listened to the woman he had tried to destroy. When the storm cleared, he walked back to Broken Bow without a word to anyone. Maren heard about it from Brome, who had heard it from the German family, who had thought it was the funniest thing that had ever happened. "He didn't say thank you," Brome reported. "He didn't say anything, just walked out when the weather broke and headed for town." "Did he pay them for the food and shelter?" "He left money on the floor, didn't look back." Maren thought about that for a long time. Vorn was not a man who admitted mistakes. He was not a man who changed his mind because evidence demanded it. But he was alive because of what she had taught, and he knew it, and that knowledge would sit inside him like a splinter for the rest of his days. It was not an apology. It was not conversion, but it was enough. The improvements came steadily after that. Moen designed a better door system, a double layer of boards with an air gap between them, reducing heat loss through the entrance. Maren developed a technique for reinforcing Assad walls with a lattice of woven grass, preventing the slumping that had caused so many spring failures. Together, they created a drainage system that could be adjusted as the terrain changed with the seasons. The original wagon bed shelter became a testing ground. Every new technique was tried there first, proven or abandoned, refined until it worked. The girls helped Ragna with the carpentry, Eli with the earthwork, and by the time spring arrived, the shelter had evolved into something neither crude nor desperate, but carefully engineered. Visitors came to study it. Families who had built their own shelters using Maren's principles wanted to see the improvements. Newcomers to the county heard about the widow and the carpenter and came to learn before they built anything at all. Maren taught them. Moen taught them. And slowly, the knowledge spread beyond Custer County to neighboring regions, carried by people who had learned and wanted to pass it on. "Build for the weather you have," they said, "not the house you wish for." Greentime's words still traveling, still landing in minds that needed them. Maren and Anders married in the spring of 1889. There was no ceremony to speak of, a justice of the peace in Broken Bow, with Brome and his wife as witnesses. Ragna held Eli's hand and tried not to cry. Anders wore a borrowed coat and looked almost nervous, which was the first time Maren had seen him look anything other than calm. "You're sure about this," he said, as they walked back to the claim afterward. "I'm sure. I'm not an easy man to live with. I don't talk much. I work too long. Anders." She stopped walking and turned to face him. "I didn't marry you because you're easy. I married you because you're useful. And because my daughters love you. And because—" She paused, looking for the right words. "Because you build things that last. I've learned to trust that." He almost smiled. Almost. "I'll try to deserve it. You already do." They walked the rest of the way in silence, but it was a comfortable silence. The silence of 2 people who had found something worth building. The years compressed after that. The shelter expanded. Moen added a proper above-ground room beside the original dugout, a frame structure with sod banking, and a drainage system that could handle any thaw. The wagon bed chamber became storage, then root cellar, then emergency shelter for travelers caught in storms. It never stopped being useful. The girls grew. Ragna became a skilled carpenter in her own right, marrying a homesteader from 2 counties over and building him a shelter that survived 6 winters without repair. Eli stayed closer to home, learning the earth and drainage work until she could read terrain better than Maren ever had. The county changed. More settlers arrived. More shelters went up, some following Maren's principles, some ignoring them. The ones that followed survived. The ones that ignored them mostly survived too, because the winters grew milder for a few years and luck covered a multitude of mistakes. But the knowledge remained, passed from family to family, spoken in kitchens and at fence lines and in the back rooms of stores where people gathered to talk about what worked and what didn't. Build for the weather you have. Maren heard it repeated by people who had never met her, who did not know where the phrase came from, who simply believed it because it was true. Silas Vorn died in the winter of 1893. He had never apologized to Maren. He had never admitted he was wrong. But in his final years, he had quietly changed the way he ran his store. He stocked better materials. He extended fairer credit. He stopped buying distressed claims from desperate settlers. When people asked why, he shrugged and said nothing. But Maren knew. The splinter had worked its way deeper than even she had expected. She did not attend his funeral, but she sent flowers and a note that said only, "Thank you for keeping your word." It was the closest thing to peace they would ever have. Brome died in 1895. Lute Jessen in 1898. One by one, the people who had been there at the beginning passed on, leaving behind children and grandchildren who had grown up hearing stories about the blizzard and the widow and the buried wagon. Maren kept teaching as long as her body allowed. She walked claim sites into her 60s, studying terrain, advising on drainage, showing young families how to build for the weather they had. When her legs gave out, she taught from her chair, sketching diagrams in the dirt with a stick, explaining angles and weight distribution to anyone who would listen. Anders died in 1903, quietly, in his sleep, in the room he had built with his own hands. Maren buried him on the rise beside Ola and Grindheim, where the wind never stopped. She lived another 4 years after that. The claim passed to Eli after Maren died. Ragna was too far away, too established in her own life, to take it on. But Eli had never left, and she knew every inch of the land, every drainage path, every shelter that had been built and rebuilt over the decades, every story that the soil remembered. The original wagon bed was still there, buried under years of grass and sod, barely visible as a slight rise in the terrain. Eli kept it that way. It was not useful anymore. The above-ground rooms had replaced it long ago, but it was important. It was where everything had started. She told the story to her own children. They told it to theirs. And the story changed in the telling, the way stories always do, becoming simpler and stranger and more like legend than history. A widow alone on the prairie, a wagon bed over a hole, a blizzard that killed 17 people, a shelter that held. In the 3 decades after the blizzard of 1888, Maren Tveit Haugen helped build or advise on more than 100 shelters across central Nebraska. The exact number was never counted, she did not keep records, and many of the families she taught passed her methods to others without ever meeting her. But the phrase she had inherited from Grindheim spread farther than any single teacher could reach. Build for the weather you have. By the turn of the century, it had become common wisdom in counties Maren had never visited, spoken by people who did not know the name of the woman who first said it in a language she had learned from a dying man. Maren spent her final years in the room Anders had built beside the original dugout, looking out at a prairie that had changed and not changed since the day she arrived. Her daughters visited when they could. Her grandchildren ran through grass that grew over shelters she had helped construct. She died on a morning in March of 1907, when the thaw was just beginning and the meadowlarks had returned. They found her in her chair by the window, facing the rise where 3 graves marked the people she had lost and the man who had helped her survive them. On January 12, 1888, Elias Brome had looked at Maren Tveit Haugen and delivered his verdict. "Put your girls under that contraption," he said, "and the first hard blow will smother them before dawn." She remembered those words every winter for the rest of her life. She remembered them when the temperature dropped 60 degrees in 6 hours. She remembered them when the wind screamed against the sod walls and the wagon bed groaned under the weight of the drift. And she remembered them most clearly on the morning after, when she crawled through the entry throat and stood in the gray light of a prairie that had tried to kill her, watching smoke rise from a shelter that everyone said could not hold. They said a wagon was built to carry things away. Hers stayed still long enough to outwait the storm.